Hello and welcome to Getting Started with GitHub Actions and Django. Now this is for those of you who have never used GitHub Actions before, but you use version control all the time, as in you use GitHub all the time to manage your repositories and do all sorts of cool things with your code. So the thing about GitHub Actions that's really interesting, it has to do with this command right here. So manage.py test. Right, you might already be well familiar with this command. It allows you to run your automated tests to simulate real world scenarios, if you will, in an isolated sandbox database. And then also ensures the integrity of your release, right? It makes sure that when you are about to release code, you run this command to make sure that, well, hopefully you have everything tested. Now, there's one other thing that it absolutely can give you, and that is false confidence. So what we want to do is avoid having that false confidence, but have it all centered around our version control, all around the events that happen with our code. More specifically, when we actually push our code into GitHub itself, right? So when we push it into GitHub, I want a bunch of different things to happen. That's what GitHub Actions is all about. GitHub Actions can actually run arbitrary code. It doesn't even have to necessarily relate to your current project, but it can run arbitrary code at arbitrary times. Now, there's a lot to GitHub Actions. There's a lot of things that you can do. This is really just a taste of it centered around this idea of Python manage.py test. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so in a moment, we're going to go and create a brand new repository for this project. Now, the general idea here is you have some familiarity with Git and GitHub already, and ideally some with Python and Django as well. If you don't have experience with those things, I'm not sure if this video will be incredibly useful for you. But for everyone else who does, just go ahead and bear with me on creating a brand new repository, because we want to actually learn how GitHub Actions works. Then we'll bring it into our other projects as we see fit. Now, I'm going to name this repository Getting Started with GitHub Actions-Django, and I'm going to leave it public. You can have it as private if you want. You can add a description if you want. And then I'm also not going to initialize it with anything. I want it to be completely blank. So let's go ahead and create this repository. Okay, cool. So this is now requires us to actually create our first file. Now, typically speaking, if I was creating a brand new Django project, I would go do a lot of the Django stuff first. I actually wouldn't start with GitHub Actions, but we are going to start with GitHub Actions so you can see where things might fall apart on a pre-existing project. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and create a brand new file. You can either do it by clicking this link right here, or going to the repository that you're in and doing /new/main or whatever branch you want to use and hit enter. This will actually allow you to add a brand new file in here. Now, GitHub Actions files are in the YAML format, which if you think about it a lot like a dictionary, I think it makes it a little bit easier to use YAML. It's just a big dictionary and big configuration, but you'll see how it goes when we actually put it together. So first off, this actual file or any of these files, because GitHub Actions can have a bunch of these files, we can actually put it in a dedicated folder. So the first part of this dedicated folder is .github. So that's the actual directory itself. Next is going to be workflows. And now we're going to go ahead and actually name our file. So even if you were working locally, you're going to want to have it called .github/workflows. And then in here, I'm just going to call it test-django.yaml or test-django YAML. And this is where we're going to start off. Okay, so the first thing is we want to give it a name. So name :1-test-django. I'm going to zoom in a bit more. That's going to be just the name of the actual YAML file itself, or rather the actual workflow declared in the YAML file. Next up, we're going to give it a on::workflow dispatch:. Now, this is actually a trigger. This is actually when this workflow will run. We'll come back to this towards the end of this one, but for now, let's just leave it in as this. Next up, we're going to declare something called jobs. So workflows themselves can run various jobs, and each job can have multiple steps within it. This is just something that's, kind of made by GitHub Actions. So the job itself is going to be, we're going to go ahead and call it Django test. Now, I recommend that you stick with the same names that I do. Otherwise, maybe some things will be a little bit too different on your end. Now, the first thing I wanted to do is run on Ubuntu. Like, I can actually declare different kinds of machines or operating systems that this can actually run on, which is pretty cool. And you can run it on your own virtual machine or a Raspberry Pi or something like that as well, which is also pretty cool. Next up, we can go ahead and add in the steps that we want to do here. Now, I'm just going to be copying and pasting some of these steps because, well, frankly, it's going to be pretty easy to do in the future. And that's probably what you'll be doing a lot, is actually copying pre-existing workflows into new ones. Now, this first one is actually going to check out the code from this repository. Now, I don't actually have to do that. I don't have to use the code in this repository, but it's really nice that when this actually runs, it's actually going to use the code that's available on the repository as well by adding in this step. So the next thing is going to be adding in our Python. So we're going to go ahead and set up Python, and I'm going to use 3.10, and this is going to use another built-in action. So it's action/setup-python, and then at v2. Now, if you ever need Python installed, this is a simple way to do that, or a specific version of Python installed. So we're going to go ahead and say with, and this is going to allow us to add in our Python version, which in this case is going to be 3.10. Now, make sure you put it into a string like that. Otherwise, if you do 3.10, it will be inferred as 3.1, which is what we want to avoid. Okay, so the next thing is, of course, after we've got Python installed with Python, typically, after you have Python in there, you're going to go ahead and install requirements. Now, this, of course, is going to be run, and this is going to be pip install -r requirements.txt. So what these two lines right here are doing is really just setting up the stage, getting everything ready. So they are steps that are required, but they aren't really doing anything. This is the first step that really does something to our code that we checked out. Now, this run line is really cool too, because we can actually use a pipe and bring it down a bit to run it that way. But I like keeping them nice and tight if I can. Okay, so let's go ahead and do one more line, not a whole lot different to this one. And this is going to be running our Django tests. So run Django tests, which is simply Python manage.py test, right? So this right there, something you might be really well aware of. So the thing is that you might get tripped up on here is spacing, right? So if your spacing's off a little bit, this is the unfortunate thing about YAML, is if your spacing's off a little bit, you'll probably have some issues. So if you go into preview, hopefully it looks like this and it's actually ready to go. And of course, if you do have any issues there, just check out my actual, getting started with GitHub Actions demo here and copy my actual file. So I'll go ahead and hit commit new file. And there we go. So I now created this workflow, and you might click on the file and go, hey, I just want to run it. Well, there's no actual way to run it directly from the file. You have to go to the GitHub Actions tab here. So if we go on this GitHub Actions tab, we now see that named workflow. So this was the actual name of the workflow that I gave to the code itself, right? So if we go back into it, look at the workflow, here's that name right there. So I actually like numbering these so I have them in a specific order on GitHub Actions that I can see. And usually testing the code will be one of the first things that I'll end up doing with it. So now if I click on that workflow itself and click run workflow, I can actually now run this. And what do I mean by run it? And what do I mean by, run workflow? Well, what's happening here is a virtual machine is actually being spun up on your behalf. It maybe isn't a whole machine, maybe it's just a part of a machine, but the idea here is some sort of software is actually going to run your GitHub Action workflow. It's going to run that entire thing. So if we go back into this workflow itself and go, step by step, this is what it's going to run. It's going to check out the code using the standard git checkout methods. It's going to install Python 3.10. I'm not actually sure how it installs 3.10, but it will install that. Then we can run this command. That's our arbitrary command based off of requirements.txt, which maybe is a red flag for you right now. And then Python manage.py also will be another command that we run. But anyway, so I tried to run this workflow, and of course I get this red here, right? So this is actually not that surprising. So if I actually look at it and go into Django_test, the actual job name itself, it says pip install our requirements.txt. Hey, what do you know? And now it says no such file or directory. Well, of course there's not a file like that. I never added it, but I still tried to run this. So let's actually solve this problem. Now, going back into our code here, now, of course, there's a lot of different ways on how we could solve this problem without writing it in GitHub, but we're going to put it into GitHub. So we can go ahead and add a new file. You can create it here, or again, you can do /new and the branch that you're working on, which of course I'm using the main branch. So here we can actually go ahead and add in requirements.txt. And I'm just going to go ahead and add in Django greater than or equal to 3.2 and then comma 4.0. This is an LTS release, so that's why I'm going to use that version of Django, at least here. So I'm going to go ahead and commit it, and once we have it committed, we should be able to see that file in our repository right there. Okay, cool. So now back into GitHub Actions, I can run that workflow again. And so we'll go ahead and run it. And this time it should work. I'll go ahead and refresh to see that workflow. We want to see it show up here. It might take a moment before it actually shows up as far as the runs are concerned. And there it is. So now it's orange. I can actually click on it. Orange typically means that it's working or it's running in some form. And then we will see that requirements.txt seems to have failed again. So Django greater than or equal to, interesting. That should be, I see the error. Okay, so let's go back in. Made a small error with my requirements.txt. Probably should have just wrote out Django, but this should be less than right there. For those of you who know that well, you would have caught it. Anyways, so let's go back into our GitHub Actions and we will run it again. Now, this is very common actually. You have some sort of error in your code and GitHub Actions can catch it. In this case, it did catch it and it showed us what that was. It's a really silly error, but it's an error nonetheless that GitHub Actions is helping me be a better developer because it's catching those errors like that. And so when we come in here, we're running it now. Install requirements ended up working, and we can see the install steps for at least Django, and that it had successfully installed Django. And then, of course, now if we try to run our Django tests, well, that fails because there's no manage.py. So what we've already have so far is a really groundbreaking test, or not groundbreaking, but a ground level test of where all of our code is and how we can just run these things without actually having any of our code. Now, some might argue that this is a form of test-driven development because even in the repository itself would have a bunch of tests to make sure that it's working correctly. These GitHub workflows not only run the test code itself, but they are a form of a test because it can't run things that it doesn't have access to, which is pretty interesting. So it actually, the test in this case ends up failing. And then if we had any other steps that were built off of this would also end up failing as well. But of course, now that we've got that, let's actually create a Django project. Or, well, actually, better yet, before I create the Django project, I'm going to go ahead and create one more file. And this file is going to be .getignore. Okay, so we can actually use a getignore template in here as well. And you can just type out Python and just use that template. This is probably a good idea. This is, of course, a standard template itself. I'm actually going to go ahead and add one more thing because I'm on a Mac, and that is .ds_store. Okay, cool. So now that I have that, I'm going to go ahead and commit that file. Great. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and clone our project here. So let's go ahead and copy the URL for it. Open up Terminal or PowerShell, depending on what system you're on. And we're going to go ahead and cd into the desktop. And I'm going to make a new directory, and we'll just call this the github-actions-django. And we'll cd into that. And we'll go ahead and clone this. So git clone that URL with a period at the end, so it clones into the local folder here. So if I list things out, in my case, I only see the requirements. If I list everything out, I should see the .github folder as well as .getignore. And again, depending on what system you're on, you will see all of those things, or you should. So now what I want to do is I actually want to ensure that Python's installed. So I have Python 3.10 installed on my machine already. If you don't, I recommend that you go to python.org and install it. I have other Python installation guides as well. Let me know in the comments if that's something you need to see. But you want to have some version of Python installed, preferably later than 3.6. But once we have that, we're going to go ahead and create a virtual environment with this version of Python. And we'll go ahead and do venv and venv. And of course, this might take a moment depending on your system. So the idea, of course, is to isolate our Python code from other Python projects or even system dependencies for Python with this project, which is why we use a virtual environment. So if I list things out, I see venv is in there. If I do get status, because of that get ignore, venv should not be seen at all. Get status should be the same, which is great. So now I'm going to go ahead and activate it with source bin or venv bin activate. Or of course, if you're on Windows, then it's going to be ./venv scripts/activate. And of course, if you're using something like a VS Code and you opened up the terminal in there, it would probably activate it for you right after you created that virtual environment. But I don't want to spend a lot of time here. Instead, what I want to do is just get my Django project going. So I'll go ahead and do pip install -r requirements.txt, the exact same requirements that we had on the GitHub Actions workflow. This is what's happening right now. So it's really just to create our Django project, and that's it. Now you can also do pip install pip, and you can upgrade it as well. Now it's also recommended that you typically use python-m. So python-m pip install -r requirements.txt. But I skipped to do that because the version of pip that I'm using is definitely the virtual environment one. But that might not always be the case depending on your system. Okay, so let's clear this out. And now I'm going to go ahead and do Django-admin, start project, and I'll call this CFE home in the local repository here. Okay, so I list things out. Now I've got manage.py, I've got CFE home, all of that good stuff. If I do git add --all, git commit, and let's say blank Django project, and then git push --all. What's going to happen here is, I'm getting a permission denied error. I have different user accounts on here, so bear with me one moment. And let me try that one more time. And there we go. So I pushed the code in, no problems there. And now, of course, if I go back into the root of my project here on GitHub, I see all of that code coming through. So now I can run the test Django action again. And we'll go ahead and run that workflow. And of course, what's going to end up happening, as you might guess, is it will actually succeed. This will be a successful workflow. And this is where the problems or the false confidence comes in, is because if you run Python manage.py test and it actually doesn't test anything, well, it's going to get all green here. It's the GitHub action is going to end up working. So of course, we actually want to test it. We want a real proper test. All right, so let's go ahead and add in some actual tests now. So we'll jump into the code and we're going to go into CFE home, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a new file right here on GitHub, and we'll call it tests.py. Now, what I want is a couple tests that will certainly work. That's going to be these right here. So the first test is testing that debug is off, and the next one is testing the admin page. So it's going to go to the admin and it's going to follow it through. It's going to follow the actual redirect. It will redirect because of the trailing slash. That's it. Very, very simple tests, but they're tests nonetheless. So let's go ahead and commit this new file here. And I'm also going to jump back into my workflow, and I want to actually edit this workflow a little bit. What I want to do is I want this workflow to run automatically when I commit a change or when I push my code is essentially what I mean by that. So we're going to go ahead and do push and branches, and we'll go ahead and just use main. So of course you can have other branches on here if you'd like to actually run this workflow or to trigger it automatically. Or of course at any time you can still go into GitHub and run the workflow as well. But I'm going to go ahead and change it like this. So I actually just added that trigger. And since I just added that trigger and committed and pushed something, committing and pushing happens automatically when you edit something on GitHub. What I should be able to see is in my actions, I should be able to see this change actually running. And so what I will still get is all greens, right? So it actually ran 2 tests that were successful. That's great. However, it's not really showing me what would happen if I did have a failure. So I'm going to go back into my code, back into tests.py, and I'm going to edit this test. I'm going to go ahead and copy this test admin, and I'll paste this in here. This time I'll just go ahead and do test homepage, and this is just going to be a slash. This time I don't want to follow the redirect. It shouldn't actually redirect, so I don't want it to follow. And now I'm just going to go ahead and run this test. So I'm going to go ahead and commit those changes, and these commit and pushes happen automatically, like I said before. And of course, it's going to go ahead and run the workflow now. So there's a couple things that are important here. Number one is it's going to run this workflow every time we push code now. Then it's going to test our code every time we push as well. Both things are critical because what we could do is we could actually add additional workflows on top of this, things that will actually push this into production, which is really, really important. And so what we see here is a successful failure, right? So we wanted to see this actually run a test. First, the test was successful. Now the test has failed. The actual Python and Django test has failed. So the workflow fails, which is fantastic. That's exactly what we want. So the workflow failing means that it's not going to run any additional workflow jobs or steps or any other workflows that might depend on this one, which is also great. So that's exactly what we wanted from testing our code. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this one. Now, if you want to take your deploying Django to a whole nother level by using GitHub Actions, be sure to check out my upcoming course and book. I'll be sure to have them in the description for all the links that you might want to have. But basically, it's going to be building off of a lot of the things that we did here, but it's going to be a full-on deployment, every piece that you'll need to actually deploy it to virtual machines on Linode. So I'm really excited about that one. Make sure that you also like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us a lot, and it helps me know that you guys like this stuff and you want to see some more. So thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.